Welcome everybody to tonight's event, which is presented by the Border Crossings Origins Festival in partnership with Beyond the Spectacle. My name is David Hurd. I'm a poet, teacher and activist based at the University of Kent in the UK, and I'm co-organizer of the migrants' rights project Refugee Tales. And it's my huge pleasure and honor to be introducing our reader tonight, Natalie Diaz. Natalie Diaz was raised in the Fort Mojave Indian village in Needles, California, on the banks of the Colorado River. She is Mojave and is an enrolled member of the Gila River Indian community. She has received fellowships from the MacArthur Foundation, the Lannan Literary Foundation, the Native Arts Council Foundation, and Princeton University. She is professor of modern and contemporary poetry at Arizona State University, and in 2021, she was elected a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. Natalie's first collection, as you may well know, When My Brother Was an Aztec, was winner of an American Book Award. Her second collection, Postcolonial Love Poem, from which, very excitingly for us, she'll be reading tonight, was published by Grey Wolf Press in the US and by Faber in the UK. The book was a finalist for both the National Book Award and the Forward Prize. Writing in The Guardian about postcolonial love poem, Sandeep Palmer, the excellent poet and critic Sandeep Palmer, captured the political power of the work when she described the collection as a kind of body work, a touch that extends from the body into the page, but one that also decenters the human body. In this post-colonial state of perpetual war and institutional violence, Diaz's poetry carves out a space where the nation state can't intervene. What a crucial state, what a crucial place that state is, the space where the nation state can't intervene, if we can get there. So please join me in the best virtual way that you can in welcoming Natalie Diaz. And what I'm hearing now, I'm not hearing, but I know I am hearing thunderous applause as we begin the reading for this evening. So just to say how this is going to work, Natalie will read a handful of poems from Postcolonial Love Poem, and she and I will talk about aspects of the work, and then the floor will be open to questions from the audience, and if you could post those questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can. And we'll be leaving like 15-20 minutes at the end for questions. So Natalie, I was wondering if you might begin for us this evening by reading the title poem from Postcolonial Love Poem. Really powerful opening poem to that collection.
Yes, definitely. Gracias, David, all of you for having me, for the work you're doing, not just here, but building these conversations and spaces. I am joining you all from one of my homelands. So I am in Phoenix, Arizona right now, and this is on Akimel O'odham land, which is one of my homes, and also Pipash land, who are our cousins. Yeah, it's again, gracias, and I'll go ahead and start with this poem.
Thank you.
Post-colonial love poem. I've been taught bloodstones can cure a snake bite, can stop the bleeding. Most people forgot this when the war ended. The war ended depending on which war you mean. Those we started, before those millennia ago and onward, those which started me, which I lost and won, these ever-blooming wounds. I was built by wage, so I wage love and worse, always another campaign to march across a desert night for the cannon flash of your pale skin, settling in a silver lagoon of smoke at your breast. I dismount my dark horse, bend to you there, deliver you the hard pool of all my thirsts. I learned drink in a country of drought. We pleasure to hurt, leave marks the size of stones, each a cabochon polished by our mouths. I, your lapidary wheel, turning green, mottled red, the jaspers of our desires. There are wildflowers in my desert which take up to 20 years to bloom. The seeds sleep like geodes beneath hot feldspar sand until a flash flood bolts the arroyo, opens them with memory. They remember what their God whispered into their ribs. Wake up and ache for your life. Where your hands have been are diamonds on my shoulders, down my back, thighs. I am your culebra. I am in the dirt for you. Your hips are quartz light and dangerous, two rose horn rams ascending a soft desert wash before the November sky untethers 100-year flood. The desert returns suddenly to its ancient sea. Arise the wild heliotrope, scorpion weed, blue phacelia, which hold purple the way a throat can hold the shape of any great hand. Great hands is what she called mine. The rain will eventually come or not. Until then, we touch our bodies like wounds. The war never ended and somehow begins again.
Wow, thank you so much. That was really powerful to hear, and it's wonderful to hear the music of the voice around the page just then. Um, I was, as I was thinking about this poem in particular, I was thinking about the question of touch, which seems to be a kind of key political thematic that's running through the volume. I was thinking also there's the book's beautiful dedication. I'm thinking of the touch and tenderness you deserve. And I just wondered if you could say something about the way this poem or the collection generally articulates the idea of touch and what touch is meaning in the work.
Yeah, I think a lot about, I mean, I guess we all do, probably in particular right now. We
Yeah.
think a lot about touch. And I think this is an interesting time in which people who don't normally think about other people and the conditions in which many of us live are suddenly realizing, like, oh, this is what it means for me not to have the things that remind me I am a body deserving of um, of a full life, of all the moments of life. And I think primarily about touch. One, I think language is a type of touch. I think it's one way we touch others, and I also think it's one way that we can return to ourselves in a way of touch. Sometimes we call that introspection. Sometimes we call that reflection. And I think that's a way of trying to touch or hold our lives in this much larger living world that we're in. And also, I was a basketball player
Yeah.
most of my life, and so and I grew up in a family, a 2-bedroom house with, I think there were 13 of us. Like, you learn touch in a very different way, and so for me, I know the world by my physical relationships with it, the same way, like, I feel like my language, on the page is a muscular kind of language. Like, even that I like to hold a book when I read, whether or not, I remember them in my head. Yeah, and so I guess that's like a question that I'm asking often in the book. I'm trying to hold the bodies that we can very easily identify, which is like an indigenous body or a queer body, or in my case, a Latinx or Mexican body. As well as, like, the bodies that we're not supposed to love. Like, in this case, there's a very specific body of the brother who doesn't behave according to standards we would call good, and yet who still deserves the labor of our love. So I guess that's where I'll start that conversation with you, is thinking of touch in that way.
It's really rich. And I was thinking also, and do you think through touch as you think about the relation of the poems to the environment, or the relation of the writing to the environment? Is that part of the medium?
Well, I think, I like the space that you just laid out for me to wander around in. So I appreciate that. I mean, I really can't disconnect the fact that language is physical. As I'm making words, part of this, I think, has definitely been shaped by my work with my indigenous language, so, which is the Mojave language, or Makav, and I'm currently learning my Atam language, so that's a newer language for me. I only know small pieces of it, but the way that I learned it, because I learned it as for the most part, as a second language learner, I learned Mojave. But to be able to see that it is about what is happening it's about, yes, what has happened, but also at the same time that is what is happening. And so I think as I make language, there's a way that I guess I think of the resounding, or we can think of an accordion or rippling out, but I feel like every word I try to hold on to or touch or be in relationship with when I'm making a poem or when I'm telling a story even, I want to see it go out and come back in and then come back out in a surprising way. So I think etymology is an extremely physical relationship. And it's a labor. I think something like etymology really tests you or tries you, and because it does. Etymology holds how awful we've been. Each word has a very long and winding story about the terrible things it's done. And also, here we are in that language with those words, and imagining how we might touch or make or even, unravel the next thing with these words.
We could stay here a long time, since this is so interesting, and we'll need to move on in a moment. But as you talk about the holding the words, I'm wondering then about the process of writing, and whether that process is a slow process and that you kind of allow each word to settle, or it's not a slow process. I'm sure it differs from work to work, but is there something you can say about your process in relation to these themes?
Yeah, I think I also like thinking about process. I like thinking about like Genesis, process, practice. I think my language in particular, I think, is very fast, just generally. I think fast. I move with a kind of physicality. Like I live like a basketball player in the world because my life was shaped that way. I live like someone who grew up in a very small place with many bodies. So there's a way I enter a room, much less the page. And yet knowing that I want to touch everything. And when I say touch, often I mean push back.
Right.
I'm not one of those people who, I'll say yes to any possibility, but when someone gives me a statement, my immediate thought is no, and so there's a way that I often push back, and that's one of the ways that I touch, I think. And yet I think what I don't trust, and this has become part of the way I write, is I don't trust what happens once I make my mark on the page. So I don't trust the font. I don't trust the script, the manuscript, I guess you could say. And that's the place where I come back and I'm very slow and I'm very like obsessive or methodical. We have all these ways, but for me, it's just a long inquiry. Every poem I write, you can follow all of these words back down to a root, and it's possible that there are simply 2 or 3 words from which every other word has sprung from in many ways, and so, so I think there's a little bit of, I guess momentum. Again, I write like I played basketball, is, fast when you can be fast, and slow and a kind of resistance when you need to, to hold and wait for the next opening or the next space to happen.
And last question around this: is there a counter to touch that you're working with and aware of? What I mean is, so if you're talking about the touching of bodies and the holding of bodies, and I guess the caring for bodies, is there a counter, whatever it is that maybe the state does to bodies? And I wonder if there's a terminology around that also.
I think, I'm really interested in redefining what we mean by violence, because I think it lets us get away with a lot of violence, because we have certain definitions of it. We can't agree who actually commits it. We no longer have an idea of what self-defense is. Who can defend themselves? Who can defend themselves from what they began in the first place? I'm thinking, of course, specifically about Israel and Palestine. And I'm also thinking about the reservation. We are one of the largest sites for extraction. Here, Oak Flats is a large battle, and suddenly you're criminalized for your resistance to trying to protect not just your own homelands and ways of life, but an understanding that the earth is a living thing, and you're trying to protect something for the entire human species and non-human species, and that becomes criminalized. And so I'm thinking, in terms of touch, I think there are all kinds of touches, right? And I guess one of the things that I'm interested in this is not necessarily a direct answer, David, but I'm thinking a lot about what it means to hold.
Yeah.
And is to hold or to be held, how does that relate to touch?
Yeah.
And what does that mean to be carried or to bear of whatever it is we have first touched? Because I think touch itself can be quite deceptive, and I think, I'm thinking of like Karen Barad's work, and I'm just thinking of the very little I know about physics, quantum physics in particular. But just, that touch, like any other thing, is a relationship of the body, of what we at least think we are as a human flesh body, and what that might mean. And we tend to think of touch only as this is why I really enjoy or appreciate this question that you've asked, that I know I won't have an answer here, but I will think long about it. But touch, the thing that I'm most interested about touch is in that non-human species, right? What does touch mean if I consider myself simply one agent, or one being capable of touch in a very large expanse of different kinds of touch? So like you asked, like, what does it mean in relationship to the quote natural world, or to the land, or to the water? What does that mean to touch? And does it always have to mean to make a mark? Does it should it always be reciprocal? Does it mean that you leave something better than when you arrive? Like, what are our questions as we try to figure out what touch means to us outside of simply a communication between two human bodies?
Yeah, I love that sense of holding that was coming through there. But I won't. We should move to the next poem, which would be great. So thank you. The next poem I was hoping you might read, which takes us back to moving, is "Isn't the air also a body moving?" Might you be able to read that one for us?
Yeah, I was wondering, this is probably terrible, so I was wondering if I could slip in a different poem in place of that.
Go ahead.
I think, so this is, and I know we wanted to read from Postcolonial Love Poem, but this is a new poem that I've been working on. And I feel like in some ways it's related to you all, because it was for the Manchester Literary Festival. So I've been slowly, they put out an early first draft, so I've been slowly working on it. But to me, it feels like the kinds of ways I've been thinking about touch during the pandemic. And so you'll hear some of that language. It's called Pandemic Furniture. There's a kind of reworked phrasing of George Nakashima, who was a Japanese-American furniture designer, architect, designer, who was placed in a Japanese-American incarceration or concentration camp in Minidoka. And so there's a quote from him, and then like a reworked quote. And then there's also a kind of, you'll hear me pulling like Unrestful World and Slum of Lakes from Eero Saarinen, who was a Finnish designer and architect as well. So, and who both had different relationships with border and migration. So, and then I'll stick to the script after that.
No, this is great. Thank you very much.
It's also because I've been revising it, so I kind of want to hear, I kind of want to see what's happening with it. So I appreciate your generosity. Pandemic furniture. It's violence, a condition of occupation, complement of its occupants. Furniture determines an individual's world in relationship to the universe, not the universe itself. Still, yet, the occupation, its occupants, their furniture, each uncountable as damage. Furniture and its personal belongings. I am holding my mother's purse and her phone. This hospital chair is an event of my body. Flexed calf, ankle hooked around the chair leg, the confusion of chair and the body, our unrestful world, Saarinen's slum of legs. I'm always abiding the bodies who don't love us to abide the body I love. One of those bodies is pandemic. A bed is shaped for what is done there. My mother is in the hospital bed. I tell her and her wound, rest, but don't dream. Abide, but don't dwell. The furniture beetles arrive with their instruments and aesthetics of work. A group of furniture beetles is called an infection. One bores into my mother's foot. Why her foot, I ask. Appendages, furniture, echoes the furniture beetle, descending the wound. My mother tells a joke. A coffin is not furniture, but its handles are. I try moving my mother's wound from her foot to the other side of the room. I am bad at domestics and the wound remains. I'm considering becoming part of the furniture, the wound says, spilling dust from itself or my mother. Furniture is not the body, but what they do to ours. I press the red button. The nurse arrives, says, the wound has remained long enough to be classified by the health department as an abode. I look inside. The wound has a bed with a full set of linens, an entire dining room, a dresser with drawers of silk socks, a small pistol with a wooden grip. The nurse says, let's not say occupation. Let's say your mother is a host. I tell my mother, next time we're asking for an unfurnished wound. My mother says, they don't require a table and chairs to make use of us. I know I'm throwing that at you off.
No, this is great. I'm going to ask you in a moment. I'm going to offer a response here. Through the project that I mentioned right at the beginning, Refugee Tales, we work with people who are detained under immigration rules in the UK. And if you go into one of those centres, one of the things that you're shockingly struck by is the furniture. And what you go into, what's called the visiting area. It's all plastic. It's a horrible kind of plastic seating. These people who are otherwise 24 hours a day, more or less, in their cell, uncharged with anything. There's one color furniture for the visitor, and there's a different color furniture for the person who's being held in that situation. Wow. And then they're spaced in such a way that there can be no intimacy between the people. So I'm just offering that as a kind of an example. But I'm wondering then what took you to furniture as a way of kind of thinking about the space and relationships that you're trying to talk about here.
Yeah, I think of furniture in some ways as being like a kind of language. And, yeah. I think of like the English language, for example, it's quite prophetic for many of us. It's projecting what we are capable of or what we will not be capable of. Like, for example, every word we have attached to freedom or to relationship, kinship, heirship, heritage, it's all related to land as property. So it's very difficult I believe, for an indigenous person living in an occupied place to speak about relationships through this language. And I mean, something I'm also struck by, is like furniture itself is like all the different ways it's been described. And like, for example, in Mojave, we don't have words for generic furniture unless they've been borrowed, because it's like a chair is what you do versus what you do it on. So it's about rest, or it's about positioning yourself to have a conversation, so it's more about the intention of the body or the practice of the body versus the object. And, as I was like, and also I'm interested in architecture and furniture. So I'm in a couple projects where we're actually making things, but as you were saying, this particular furniture, I think a lot about visiting my own siblings in prisons. My partner is very involved with women in detention, in particular, and lately women from Cameroon, but not always, women from other places, such as, Mexico. We're on the US-Mexico border. And we talk a lot about these spaces. And I'm really interested too in like the idea that there is a furniture of war. Right. So sometimes that means like armor and guns. And sometimes it's simply the furniture that colonizers send as they begin to settle in the area, you know. So I'm thinking, of course, like a lot of the actual documents I found were of like the British Empire sending these large shipments of furniture, or even like the country itself was running out of furniture because they had sent so much of this kind of you know, these furniture to make spaces for soldiers or for, you know, people in power. So that's something I'm thinking a lot about. I'm also thinking a lot about the fact of how furniture determines who owns the space.
Yeah.
You know, so like here, the US-Mexico border, we have a lot of rules, or we had, quote, rules in place for like the Graves Act, so that you can't disturb graves, or Endangered Species Acts. But as soon as they, I'll say they, because there are many theys, get like 1 foot in the door and put in 1 fence post, then it's open, it's fair game suddenly. Or I'm thinking, of course, about, you know, Palestine. You know, I've been in the homes where Israeli settlers, in, you know, the one case I'm thinking of was actually an American who built a house on top of a Palestinian family and then demanded they keep their door open so that he and his family could walk through their house at any hour. They weren't allowed to lock the door to get to his home, his new settled home built right on top of them. And then was waiting for them to just not be able to bear it anymore, to not be able to take that kind of like daily trauma alongside, like, you know, a lot of taunting and things, you know, or the ways even that their, you know, Palestinian families are being built under, you know, I'm thinking in particular of Jerusalem. This moment I was talking about was in Hebron, but yeah, so I guess I'm just thinking too about furniture is, to me, a prophecy of occupation. And what does it mean that you invite somebody into a room in which, like, they are, like, for example, I'm often the only native in a room. And I realize as I look around, like, how uncomfortable I am. And some of it has to do with, you know, furniture is one symptom of a larger structure of supremacy that we always refuse to, that we refuse to recognize. And I just thought furniture might be a place where we can all meet and wonder together, since, you know, for the last year and a half, we've had intimacy with our furniture, I think, in ways that we haven't before. So as a long-winded answer, I apologize. I know we're trying to stay on track.
No, it's a great answer. It's really interesting. And how about, and what about the poem itself in relation to furniture? I mean, the poem, I guess, must be a completely other way of organizing space, a way of organizing space that isn't that kind of imposition that furniture constitutes. Is that how you're thinking of it?
No, well, it's built in very small stanzas, so like 4 or 5 line stanzas. But I was trying to actually imagine what it would look like to look down on a chair. So it's almost as if I'm imagining them just lined up in a row. And I've been looking at a lot of building plans lately of, you know, from my university. We're moving into a new building, and they, you know, are telling us how innovative this space is. And I'm like, there's just a large square with several small squares. But even that, I think, is an interesting thing. So in some ways, I'm trying to hold myself to imagine what does my stanza look like if it's just a very basic chair. And I haven't quite, you know, it's still in its early phases, but in a way that I haven't done before. The stanzas are quite small, very short lines. So I'm glad you asked that, because I feel like it will give me an opening to return to that.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that poem. We appreciate that. Maybe isn't the air also a body moving? Is that a good point to move to?
We have that, or you had that which cannot be stilled.
Yeah, either, whichever you would prefer to read.
Whichever you prefer to talk about. I'm just going to toss it back to you.
Okay, then I would be very interested at this point, that which cannot be stilled, please. That would be great.
Okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, I know that, like I said, I didn't want to get too far off. Yeah, so this poem is also a little bit about me coming to read John Ashbery, which I've always been resistant to any American canon. So I almost refused to read him just because I was told to. But Anyhow, he shows up here. And this was a poem that began as a letter to an American poet, Ada Limon, who's a friend of mine. That which cannot be stilled. Ash can make you clean, as alkaline as it is a grief. My internet research calls it a disinfectant, but life is faster research and unavoidable. Dirty Indian, a phrase blown like magnetite dust against the small bones in my ear many times and dark. Sometimes I believed them. I'd look around my reservation, around our yard, our house, dirty, I'd say, like I was a doctor with a diagnosis, except I was the condition. All my life, I've been working to get clean. To be clean is to be good in America. To be clean is the grind. Except my desert is made of sand, my skin the color of sand. It gets everywhere. America is the condition of the blood and of the rivers, of what we can spill and who we can spill it from. A dream, they call it, what is American. Back home, we believe in dreams, heed what happens in fours as lucky. 4 iterations of anything in a dream, a shade, an ancestor, a gesture, a cloud, 4 fat quails making a campanile of the mesquite tree, 4 hands shuttling nighthawks along a loom of electrical wires. I've had a recurring dream my entire life. It is night. I'm in the dune field on the edge of the res, tending each blue gold mound smooth, undisturbed, each quartzed particle in its place. But a baby is crying in the green wooden crib, or someone is fighting someone else, a quavering radio, a distempered dog. I sorrow for silence, motions the dune soft with my hands, and please, which is no invocation for peace. I step lightly, I am holding my breath, maintaining to keep it all from shifting. Then it happens. Through what was perfect, a carbon rubble sifts up, tangled rebar, torn fences, scrambled sheet metal, oxidized and spiking, breaking the sand like it's my own skin. I feel the junk of it all in my body, a rising wild. I can't stop the happening. The rusting is in me, like how a deep wound heals, glimmered, open. There is no pattern of 4 in this dream, just land and its moving, the dunes and how they are taken, reorganized and reckoned, grains loosened, Archimedes, myriads, sifting in a coppered stream. Saltation, they call it, from Latin saltere, meaning to jump or leap. Isn't that what we do on the page? John Ashbery died today, and tomorrow is my birthday. Maybe death is a way to clean the self of the body, to finally celebrate it. A celebration should leave a mess. Oh, lit pyre of my anxiety, the ash silver, it streaks heavy across my chest and brow. The doctor asked, "Do you feel a sense of doom?" Instead of replying, I wrote, "What do you call a group of worms, if not a worry, if not a wonder?" That was before I knew a dune has a slip face and a slack. I have read more Ashbery today than I read when he lived. It's true that life can be anything, but certain things definitely aren't it. Like the red sugar horses and their satellite eyes, sphering and sick beneath the decks of your body, their ship. We know how to speak to our conquerors, don't we? What if you whisper into the long ear of one, say, "Beloved occupier, beloved hoof and stiff green gallop"? Then tell them a story about the horse latitudes, a place so still not even the wind will go there, that if they can't get it together, won't quit making a mess of you, those animals, won't stop carouseling your blood to hippodrome, we might take them there, to some vast middle, lead them over the decks, and far from the desert, give them up to the sea. Watch the slow green blue dunes lift open and disrupt everything which cannot be stilled.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. So I was, as I was reading this poem, I was thinking in particular about the way poetry either intersects with or opens or challenges politics. I mean, I don't want to go down the Ashby route, although one of the things that I know Ashby couldn't do was he couldn't do politics in poems, and this is a poem really that does politics. And
he had that luxury.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I'm especially interested in how politics plays out at the level of practice, and what the poem is opening up that challenges or interrogates politics. And there's that great line where you kind of describe practice. You say saltation, they call it, from Latin saltare, meaning to jump or leap. Isn't that what we do on the page? And I was wondering if in that account of practice, that what we do on the page, that's a sense of how poetry intervenes on politics and challenges and opens up spaces that politics is always closing down.
Yeah, I think often about just what it means to be a poet, why I say why it matters, and I don't mean to a much larger world. The biggest question is, how can poetry make me live better, make me relate better to people, whether they're intimate, I know them intimately, or they're strangers. But I think poetry's attention to language, I think, is why I think it could have a value. And I mean, I think sometimes it does, but I guess what I wonder is what lasts of poetry right now.
Yeah.
That's the thing that I'm really wondering. I think back to some of the older poets. I was just talking with a friend, and we were talking about Iranian poetry, and she was, we were actually out in the desert, and she said, we had been camping, and she said, I wish that we were in those days when poets were also astronomers and mathematicians.
Yeah.
And so I think, I guess the question I have, I try to ask it of myself often, and I try not to overly criticize it, but to think of it as a critical question I can turn back to myself and my own work. But I guess I'm wondering about the relationship which says poetry matters to these politics versus that language itself is political. And sometimes political in a way in which we don't have a choice, right? Like there are words that, like I'll pull it out of poetry and set it in a different context, but the word sovereignty, for example, what does that mean? It's essential to Indigenous peoples because of our relation in the United States, because of our relationship with the government. So it's now a word that has that we have to traverse, and we have to find ways to have a reciprocal kind of communication with our government because of it. Now, I don't think that's very different than what's happening in a poem. I think when I think of the politic of a poem, I think it's political simply that I'm writing a poem, that I'm not dead or disappeared somewhere, considering where I've come from. So there's that very real fact, right? And that's, I think, we tend sometimes to get away from that. A political aspect I think about as well, like right now, for example, what's happening in Myanmar, what's happening in Yemen, what's happening in South Africa, what's happening in Colombia, what's happening in Palestine. One of the ways we are communicating is through poetry. And that, I think, has a really beautiful power. And that, to me, kind of harkens back to the power poetry had when it was oral, when it was passed and carried, not just retweeted, but carried from one place to another. So I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in the other direction of that politicization, right? Like, I think we think of the poet or their poems as political, but I think poetry itself has a lot of really problematic political structures. You know, I think, and I'm thinking of my work in particular, but I think many people don't expect me to use the English language the way I do. You know, like I've had the question, well, who is this poetry for? Because all these big words. That was almost verbatim what somebody said. And I think, like, well, why wouldn't I know it, the language? I mean, you could give me any language and I'm going to learn it. Like, I mean, I love language, but I think there's something about the ways that we have to consider that political relationship as a reciprocal relationship, because I think there's only, you know, so much a poetry can do within the confines of what we consider poetry itself.
Yeah.
Versus what we've all seen in the communities where we carry poetry. You know, like the communities you're working in, I've seen how important poetry is to people who are being held in detention, or people who are inside, you know, and I guess that's the thing that I'm most interested about how we hold poetry next to politic, is that I don't know if it's going to be walls of Jericho kind of thing, where we say poems enough, long enough, hard enough that the structures of empire or nation states fall. But I think, I know, I've felt it myself, even me being on the reservation. I think how poetry arrived at me is often how it works in the real world, is that poetry is for the people, you know, and what do we as people who are alongside one another in certain struggles, or who are struggling ourselves, like, how can we use that to touch, back to like what you asked first, right? Like to touch one another, not, and I don't believe in empathy, so I don't mean in an empathetic way. I just mean to say, like, I do not know what it's like to be held in detention. And yet, if this is a way I can be alongside you and give you the space to speak your emotions, or to find language for it, or simply to sit in a space of knowing your experience of this matters, then that's enough for me. Or, you know, knowing what, I mean, my sister was in prison recently. I know I don't have any siblings in prison, you know, hallelujah, right now, but I often have, and reading is what got my sister through. You know, like that was her conversant, and poetry is such a generous space for that. So again, I you know, another really long-winded answer. I you know, and I'm yeah, I feel like you know the largeness of this is, and that I can't ever arrive at it. But I guess that's when I think of the politics of poetry, I'm thinking less about, again, that it might crumble the walls of the White House. You know, I think what I'm thinking about is that we have a lot of people held in cages right now.
Yeah.
That it might reach in a different way.
That's brilliantly said. I'm glad we're recording that. That's a wonderful answer. I'm not. I'd love to continue this line of conversation, but I'm really aware that other people need to come in, and we'd all love to hear just one more poem, if that was okay. Could we now go back to "Isn't the air also a body moving?" Because there's just one or two lines in that I seem so important, and it'd be lovely to hear the poem.
Yeah, definitely. And I hope we can have this conversation longer. I'm just getting to know all the work you all do. So I would love to, down the road, for us to, you know, have you in conversations here as well. So
I would like that very much, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. So, and this is also part of, like, I don't know, they call it a suite of poems, I guess, with Ada Limon, she's a Mexican-American poet. Let me get my hair out of the way. I feel like I'm reading like a big mountain of I forgot my hairbrush on this trip. So you're seeing me in my very native Mojave state. Isn't the air also a body moving? It holds the red jet of the hawk in its hand of dust. How is it that we know what we are, if not by the air between any hand and its want? Touched. I am touched. I am. This is my knee since she touches me there. This is my throat as defined by her reaching. What pressure, the air, buoying me now along a minute the size of a strange room. Who knew air could be so treacherous to move through? An old, anxious sea, or waking too early in a coppered and indigo morning, or the bookmark she left near the end of the book. All deep blues and euphemisms for my anxieties. Sometimes I don't know how to make it to the other side of the bridge of atoms of a second, except for the air breathing me, inside, then out. Suddenly, I am still here. Escaping must be like this for the magician and mortal both, like lungs and air, a trick of bones and leaving any capture, a breath. Everything is iron oxide or red this morning here in Sedona. The rocks, my love's mouth, even the chapel and its candles, red. I have been angry this week. Christian said, trust your anger, it is a demand for love. Or it is red. Red is a thing I can trust, a monster and her wings, cattle grazing the sandhill stones like flames. Caboose cars were once red, and also the best parts of the trains, the heat and shake of what promised to pass. Finally, the red and the end of them. Maybe this living is a balance of drunkenness off nitrogen and the unbearable atmosphere of memory. From the right distance, I can hold anything in my hand. The hawk riding a thermal, the horizon, which across many days might lead to the sea, the red cliff, my love glazed in fine red dust, your letter, even the train. Each is devoured in its own envelope of air. What we hold grows weight, becomes enough or burden.
Wow, that's so great. There's such a wonderful sense of what it means to be a body in air there, and but also there's just the politics of that. The question that you ask partway through that early on, who knew air could be so treacherous to move through? I just that seemed to me to capture something that I've wondered about in relation to people who are displaced into the UK and are forced to occupy a hostile environment, and then the air itself would seem treacherous. But I wondered if you could just say, before we move to other people, what that question was meaning to you, the who knew air could be so treacherous to move through.
Yeah, I think in some ways I'm always thinking about what I might mean by freedom.
Right.
Or, it's not a word I use. My partner, my wife is a queer Black poet. And we talk about this a lot, that perhaps what I want in my state of existence as a citizen of this country is not freedom. And yet I also must know what freedom means for other people. I think we use it in such a blanket way. And so I think I'm wondering a lot about that. What does free feel like for some people? And again, like, you know this, like literally the air in many carceral systems, it's so fucking cold, and they keep it cold intentionally so there's no comfort, and what does that mean, or what does it mean to to move through a day? And I have like pretty severe anxiety, and have since I was little. It's something related to things in my early life, but I'm thinking too about the idea of that, like, the Creeley line that I pulled from, the idea that it could be enough or it can be a burden. And often when it becomes a burden, it's simply because you're allowed to recognize it as such. Otherwise, it becomes a thing that fills your life. I was thinking a lot too about, we have an area in the desert that the policy is called prevention through deterrence. And so we've closed enough ports of entry and pushed migrants to cross in one of the most dangerous parts of our desert. And what does that mean, to have to carry what you need, and that even what you need, such as water, becomes a burden of weight in those moments. Yeah, and so I think there's just always this kind of constellation working. And I don't, again, I'll kind of stop there and see like if I'm moving too far away from your question, or, you know, what you're thinking as well.
No, that's, I mean, that is where the question was going. And then I guess what I'm wondering as well is, so there is that sense of walking through moving through a terribly hostile air or space. But then, but does the poem seems to settle somewhere that it's more content with, if I'm reading it right. So I can hold anything in my hand, the hawk riding a thermal, the horizon which across many days might lead to the sea, the red cliff, my love. Apologies for my reading, but are you arriving at a sense of being in the air, or being a body moving in the air, which is possible to be at least, you know, temporarily comfortable with, at ease with? I don't quite know what the word would be, but is that where the poem is arriving?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And I think, you know, I think comfort is not something I think a lot about. I think I should think more about it, especially because I have comforts. But I think there are certain, you know, that word, like, you know, treachery, like, what is treacherous, I think is something that feels important to me, because I'm trying to put myself in this state in my work in particular, in that I can, like, where I turn to is not away from the state and what it's doing, but also not only pushing back as a kind of resistance, but to say that I have a natural capacity for love, or for friendships, and for all of these, and for these other aspects of life, right? Like, life itself is a violent thing, whether it's a plant growing, or a tree, or the way a river moves, you know, or the ocean. And so I think that is something I've been thinking a lot about, is, you know, as well as I was writing this, I knew I was writing alongside Ada. So we were writing to one another, and she was also moving across. And this was a time in the United States where, you know, I was not one of these people, but I had friends who, you know, who were from Central and South America by descent, but grew up here, who began carrying their passports. Like, there was just a kind of a fear that hit people who were normally not used to having this kind of precarity, this manifested precarity, I guess, in terms of that, you know, your visible self was not just something that could be projected upon, but it was something that, again, could be criminalized. And so it was a moment when those things were very much on my mind. And again, you know, some of the work my partner was doing, and we open our home, so we often have, for us, you know, mostly women, or queer or trans people who are in some process of seeking asylum. And so often they'll stay with us, you know, so once their bails are posted, then they'll be with us. And so it's a very different, you know, it's a very different relationship. Like, yes, I have my experience of being on the reservation and what my own body means, and yet to be alongside and in a living space with some of these people and their experiences, I think, you know, it just really, I don't know, it's charged the world in a way that is a slightly different frequency than some of the charges I'm used to, you know, to being able to hear or tune out in order to live my own individual, you know, autonomous life.
Thank you. It's a great answer. We should certainly move. There are one or two questions in the Q&A in the chat, and so if it's okay, I'll just read them to you, Natalie. So the first is from Ariel Khan, and the question, it's a great question. How might knowing etymologies and moving between languages and cultures help us unravel, in quotation marks, or challenge the future direction of both language and culture? How might we embody that new knowledge?
Yeah, that's a very generous question, Ariel. I appreciate that. You know, maybe one of the ways I think about etymology is, I think there has to be space for misunderstanding. And that's something, it's why I love poetry. You know, the fact that we all have a different reading, even though we think, like, if I'm writing a poem about the brother, you may have a brother, you may not. It's and definitely not mine. And yet the poem will happen, a brother will happen. Or even the ways, I talk about what is political or the state, or, what is America, for example. But for me, there's something about etymology that has to do with capacity for imagination. Because again, language is so prophetic, all the things I've learned to call myself before I began to really hold my indigenous language were completely limiting. They are projections of the makers of that language. And I try hard to salvage Latin in its relationship to English, because, isn't one of the theories that Latin popped up on a river, right? Wasn't it and so I feel like I really believe that language is the land. It's a like, we are of the land as people. I am a desert person. I was born and raised here. The way I see light, the way I see dark, the way I move, the things I want, the way I desire, that's like shaped by the desert. And so my languages as well, and my Makab or Mojave language is very much shaped by the desert. And I think that's one way that etymology is important, is that it's recognizing the land if we go back far enough. And it's also recognizing like when we begin to dislocate from it, or who tried to dislocate us from it. And that feels essential to me, just knowing that. Again, like I mentioned earlier, like all of the English relation, not all, I'm making a generalization. There are many English words that are supposed to describe familial and intimate and loving and caring relationships that are rooted to land as property and who gets it. I'm so fascinated by like heritage or legacy, because we use those as senses of pride, and then you realize like, oh wait, it was simply a matter of like being able to, whether land was public or private, or what was the commons, or who got the land, or even kinship. It's a word we use often in indigenous spaces, is kinship. And again, it's very tethered to property. So I guess in terms of embodying it, for me, etymology, or being able to hold the all together, like that I can hold Mojave, next to Spanish or next to English, and that I can make a living, like a life. I mean, God, isn't that a shame that when we say make a living, we mean money? That just struck me as being horrible. But that I can live and build my relationships and imagine and dream, because those things sometimes are not congruent. And English often cannot understand Mojave. And Mojave in many ways refuses certain parts of English, And that, I guess, is what feels important to me. I feel like etymology is one way we can hold ourselves, maybe not even accountable, but awake to or aware to some of the ways our language has been shaped and who it has been shaped for or against. But I think also, and I also think like it's creating the space for us not understanding. Like, I don't know, Ariel, if you have other languages, or what your languages are. But for me, the tension between one and the other, and the misunderstanding between one and the other, are essential to, to what I think of as autonomy, which it only exists in relationship to a whole. And I don't know, I mean, I think poetry is one of the most prime examples of misunderstanding, even though we're always about clarity and accessibility and all of these things. But whoever understands like who, quote, understands it, what does it mean? It simply becomes, and I guess that's the answer, right? Like poetry for me is one type of embodied experience. Somehow language begins to happen in your body, and you leave, whether you leave bored or excited or wondering, we leave it different, even if it was simply the fact that we stopped for 10, 30, whatever, however many minutes to read a poem in a world that is, right now we're killing people, and here we are talking about poetry. What a lucky facet of life.
That's a very generous answer to Ariel's question, and I hope I feel sure the question has been answered. I'm just wondering on that question of understand. I wonder if what we have in relation to poems is precisely that, a relation to poems rather than an understanding of poems. But this is not my space. There's another question here from Michael. Michael says, I'd be interested to hear Natalie talk about how these ideas about air and the body also relate to the sense throughout this book of the body being water. Water seems so important to the eco-politics of her work.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, it's elemental, right? Also, David, what you just said about that, the relationship, that I think is an exciting place to press on later. And I think it's one of the reasons why the George Nakashima quote felt so important to me, was that he was saying furniture is, it's a relationship to the world, but it's not the universe, you know? So suddenly making something that seemed very large, small. But returning to this wonder about air and water, you know, I mean, air in some ways is a fluid, you know, like, I guess one of the reasons why air and atmosphere, we talk a lot about it. Like we, in the desert, you know, we talk a lot about the weather, but not in terms of it's raining, it's sunny. The way the clouds look on a certain day can mean doom. You know, for my elders are like, there's something wrong with the clouds, like there's something is coming. But as well, that we can sense water on the air. You know, the trees sense it in certain ways, like small ways that they move their leaves, or the way, you know, leaves will open. And I'll just say, leaves in the desert are very different than leaves where some of you might be. You know, our leaves are often smaller. And but yeah, I mean, to me, I guess my relationship with water, it feels extremely lucky, because I think so many people are trying to find a way to connect to where they are. I think I'm thinking of air or atmosphere also as a part of place, so not separate. We're so bifurcated or so compartmentalized, right? Like, you know, that you know, the in the mind's eye, the way I guess this is what I mean. Maybe let me try to be more efficient. I think it's actually about sensuality, and I think sensuality is very much what we quote know, and to understand the importance of water is a sensuality of our human lives, and I think air is also something we can be sensual to in different ways if we were able to open up beyond these like five. I don't know if there's 5 or 6 senses. I always get them mixed up because we have so many. So it feels in some ways a little bit of an arbitrary number, but yeah, I guess that's what I want to think about with this question. And pardon if it's not narrowing towards you, but maybe it can open up around all of us. That's, I guess, for me, that's what some of this work is about how can I be as sensual as possible, and again, not necessarily the senses, but sensual, so that an experience doesn't have to be one that I know or that I make the currency of knowledge out of, but that experience, whether it's quote good or bad or whatever value judgment we put on it or whatever knowledge we arrive at, it reminds me that I am of something, right? That I am one imagination, like this human body is one imagination of whatever this life is, you know, like, you know, I mean, I don't, maybe some of you do think that there was someone out there naming the animals one by one as they came in the Bible. I'm not sure. And if that's the case, I would want you to keep that story. And yet I feel like, you know, some life imagined a deer, some life imagined the human body, some life imagined a river, you know, and that they're all coming from this kind of same energy, the same energy language comes from. It's simply an imagination. In some ways, I think like our human bodies are like an estimation of life. I don't know that we are exactly the center. So in some ways, I think our lives are very similar to words and language, in that, you know, they are not the thing, but they are our desire to experience the thing, or to find a way to remember ourselves or situate ourselves somewhere near to what we don't know. I'm going quite sideways on that question. So
I love the
pardon.
way there's one more question which we should take in a moment with. I'm being told we're running out of time. That seems so unjust, but I love the way just a moment ago you took us to of, and the prepositionality of that what you were trying to describe was not the knowing of a thing, but being of a thing, or having that relation of so, and it takes maybe circles back to that sense of being in relation to a poem, and what kind of relationality the poem is making possible. But I'm just riffing, and there's a much better question coming in from the Q&A. Tata Vic says, "Thank you, Natalie. The way you craft metaphors have a physical empathy. I would love to hear more about how you approach metaphors. Secondly, how you think these metaphors, new narratives or poetry, can play a role in social change, justice work. Thank you."
Yeah, what was the last part about was it the word narratives?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm thinking a lot. So, and that was Tatevek, right? That's
Yeah.
okay. Yeah. Gracias for that question. I mean, I'm in this phase right now where I don't kind of subscribe to empathy. I think it's okay that I don't know how somebody feels, that I don't know that experience, and even that I don't. I guess I wonder why. I want to be at a place where, even if I know it's not going to happen to me, I might still make space for your worry or wonder. You know, I think it's why we're allowed to eat dinner while countries are being bombed. You know, if there was empathy, I don't know that I could live in this world if I was really able to, you know, to put myself in someone else's experience. And yet I also know that word, it is important for people to build their relationship to one another and in communities and society. So, but that's just kind of my standpoint. And I feel similar about metaphor. And I've actually been in a lot of conversations. So I teach at the university. So, and I'm a little bit, I mean, not anti-craft like ANTI, but possibly like ANTE, anti-craft. Maybe we'll say that. Because you know, I feel like metaphor, again, is a kind of construct that denies certain sensualities. And this is one perspective, you know, I don't know, maybe next week I could argue the opposite way, but I also feel like, so I'm going to be very generic about metaphor. So, you know, it's taking this thing, you know, taking these, let's say it's taking two things, but it's imagining that they aren't of, right, that they aren't of the same. And that word "of" has been really important to me lately. There's a phrase that has kind of carried me through my days, like I am of consequence, and it helps me move through a minute, and it also reminds me that I am simply a small piece of these larger energies. But I guess I think about, my question is, for metaphor, is it actually making us, I guess I think it might be trying to control what we're able to know, or what we're being asked to unknow. And so I wonder where the unknown exists in metaphor. And I'm so invested in the unknown, in what is not yet. And so I guess that's like one way that I'm thinking about this. And again, I do know that because of our language, and I think it really depends too on which language you're speaking. Like Mojave, we don't have metaphors. Like it all can really happen, you know, like I really do. I guess it's hard to explain in English because English tries to force it into a metaphor, but I really do. I am of the river, you know, it's in me in a way that that shapes my imagination, that makes me, you know, who I am. I'm of, like, this is the craziest metaphor. I'm of like a snake family. And that's just one that's really, you know, to imagine a person could also be a snake, or that I have, you know, relatives who have this relationship, like that only exists in metaphor in, you know, in English. Yeah, and so, or suddenly you're like personifying animals or something, but that does, you know, we have a word called tuach, which means there is actually no metaphor between the human body and becoming a mountain, for example, or becoming, you know, a snake. And so I'm interested in, I guess, us pressing on that idea of metaphor alongside empathy. I'm actually, like, that was, you know, gracias for setting those two side by side, because I think that it's an important and generous space to think. And in relationship to thinking, I think you would use the term social justice. Was that?
Yeah, that was in the
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something, right, that we might also consider is what are we requiring of language structures in social justice, or when we join or alongside one another in social justice. So in terms of a kind of solidarity, you know, it's interesting that, you know, for example, in Palestine, the word ceasefire happens, and so suddenly everybody diverts their attention, you know, or what is it that catches our attention and holds it, and how is what we are attending to related to something like a metaphor, you know, like what metaphors have we made to engage in Palestinian, you know, freedom, independence, right to land. Like what are the metaphors that have made us able to hold that and yet forget Yemen, for example, you know, or and one of the greatest metaphors, of course, is patriotism, you know, and what that means of. And I think we tend probably not to think of patriotism as a metaphor, but I think it's quite a grand metaphor. Anyway, I know that we're pushing time, and Tatovek, I didn't give you quite a straightforward answer on that. But yeah, I guess that's what I'm thinking of. Like what, for example, this will be the last thing I say on this. I'm sorry, David. Is if let's just say that we said right now, metaphors are dangerous to the ways we relate. So if we said that, where might that take us in a way to kind of critique or hold metaphors or language itself, or maybe our relationship to that, to hold it in, you know, to a different narrative or story? I guess that's something I'll think alongside you, if anyone who's willing to think, if they find that at all kind of like a valuable, or at least a tension that might create something.
I'm finding that extremely stimulating to think about right now, and yeah, really powerful. What you were saying a moment ago about the absence of, or the way Mojave doesn't work through metaphor. It took me to the line in. Let me just get to the page. It took me to the line, the first water is the body, in the first water is the body. I mean river as a verb, a happening, it is moving within me right now. And I'm here, as you're talking about metaphor and not dwelling in metaphor, and operating in the language differently. I'm hearing that sense of relation to river. Is that the right kind of way to hear this?
Yeah, I think, you know, and I think even within that, you know, there, and, you know, it's why I went to, like, you know, Berger and kind of toyed around with Derrida. But, you know, again, there, I think a lot of our life happens in the periphery. You know, maybe we can call that relation to our surroundings, or we might call, you know, the air itself. But, you know, touch, of course, as we know, is not the touch itself. It's the periphery of our bodies, or object. Our body is object, or body is like a physical living thing, whether it's, you know, touching a book or a person or a rock. And so, yeah, I think that's like something, you know, the happening, like what even does that mean? Like the happening, where is that in relationship to space? Like when something is happening, and how does that energy resound? And so I guess that's something I'm thinking of. And I'm glad you like kind of opened that window to look through, David, in relationship to that, because, you know, yeah, it's a verb, it's a happening, because it is the way I'm living with it here in me, as well as I am of it. And then that also creates a periphery of what it means to be alive or to move in this world. Like it's in relationship, I think, to that phrase that has been so important to me, which is like to be of consequence. So now that I have that relationship, or I have been born of that relationship to the river, for example, so that it doesn't feel metaphorical to me, what does it mean of everything around me and the way I relate to everything around me? Yeah, and I guess this comes back to kind of that simple thing, to say that I am of consequence is, I think, in some ways a lot like a poem. To have written a poem is that now finally it happens, long after I've written it, long after it's on the page, long after I've read it. It's happening wherever it goes. Yeah. As well as I think my most consequential acts, I think, happen far beyond my body. Now I'm actually going into an unknown space, so I'll stop right there, because suddenly I'm like, I'm not sure I mean that, but I know I'm wondering.
Well, for me, this has been the most wonderful conversation, and this sense of a kind of relationality that is not metaphorical, or is that outside or before, or in some different relation to metaphor. That seems really important to me. I'm going to be carrying on thinking about that now for some time. I wonder, this wasn't scheduled, but it would seem a right thing to do. I wonder if you might close by reading one more poem for us. And since we started with the opening poem of Postcolonial Love Poem, I wondered if you might just read the last poem for us, Grief Work, which is a poem that I love. And then, thank you very much.
Yeah, great. And I like that you added like before the metaphor. I want to think about that too. Like, what happens before the metaphor? I think we hinge so much on what happens after it, or, you know, in its moment. So, but yeah, gracias again, David, for your generous questions and for letting me wander around a little bit. Grief work. Why not now go toward the things I love? I have walked slow in the garden of her, gazed the black flower dilating her animal eye. I give up my sorrows the way a bull gives its horns, astonished and wishing there is rest in the body's softest parts. Like Jacob's angel, I touched the garnet of her hip, and she knew my name and I knew hers. It was auxochromo, it was chromophoro, it was Eliza. When the eyes and lips are brushed with honey, what is seen and said will never be the same. So why not take the apple in your mouth in flames, in pieces straight from the knife's sharp edge? Achilles chased Hector around the walls of Ilium 3 times. How long must I circle the high gate between her hip and knee to solve the red gold geometry of her thigh? Again, the gods put their large hands in me, move me, break my heart like a clay jug of wine, loosen a beast from some dark long depth. My melancholy is hoofed. I, the terrible, beautiful Lampone, a shining devour horse tethered at the bronze manger of her collarbones. I do my grief work with her body, labor to make the emerald tigers in her throat leap, lead them burning green to drink from the deep violet jetting her breast. We go where there is love, to the river, on our knees beneath the sweet water. I pull her under 4 times until we are rivered, we are rearranged. I wash the silk and silt of her from my hands. Now who I come to, I come clean to, I come good to. Gracias.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. As I was hearing you read, then I was wishing we had spoken about the line break, because the way you read across the line breaks was just so great there. But thank you so much.
Yes, gracias.
I know that the audience will be joining me in thanking you for a really inspirational reading and conversation. I want to let people know that on Tuesday, the Blackfeet horror writer Stephen Graham James will be reading and discussing his work. And on Thursday, we have two First Nations poets from Canada, Liz Howard and Matthew James Weigel.
You'll love Stephen.
They are the events that are coming up. But wherever you are joining this call, please join me in thanking Natalie for a wonderful and inspirational reading and a very generous series of answers to our questions. Thank you.